Hello, I'm Kathleen Wallace.
And I'm Christopher Eliot, and we are professors at Hofstra University in the Philosophy Department, and we're going to be discussing cases for the Long Island Regional High School Ethics Bowl.
Indeed, and we are going to discuss one case from the 2013-14 Regional Ethics Bowl cases for high school students. But before we do that, we thought we'd maybe discuss a few general tips about how to approach an ethics case and what kind of reasoning you want to be sort of thinking about. So, mentioning reasoning, the first thing is that you want to be giving reasons. So everybody has an opinion, but an opinion is only as good as the reasons that you can give for it.
But let's think why we would want reasons. One way to think about why we want reasons in the first place is to think about what happens when we don't have reasons.
Yeah.
So if it's just you in a situation and nobody else is affected, then you might think, well, any opinion I have is a reasonable one to have, but not if you want good reasons.
Right.
So if you want good reasons, you might need to think of what are the best reasons for opinions. Also, if other people are affected, and if other people might have opinions about the situation, where you need to be in a discussion with them about how to think about a situation, then you're going to need to compare reasons for opinions. And if you can lay out your reasons that possibly support opinions, then you'll be in better shape to figure out how to come to an agreement about them.
Right, right. So maybe we should consider an example. So how about this? Suppose you think you should lie to a friend because you think telling the truth will harm your friend in some way. So first of all, what we want to notice is avoiding harm, aiming to avoid harm, is an ethical reason. And what kind of harm might be involved here? I mean, so now you've given a reason, but now you should examine and evaluate the reason itself. So maybe you should be thinking about whether the harm of the lie, how does that compare to the actual harm of preventing whatever it is that you want, that you think is going to happen to your friend? Because after all, lying itself produces harm. What kind of harm? Well, it undermines trust. Potentially, a lie could also harm other people that you might not have thought of initially when you thought about lying to protect your friend from a harm. Another sort of consideration might involve what we sometimes think of as respect. So when you lie to someone, are you respecting that person, or are you being manipulative, or are you underestimating them? Are you perhaps leading them to do something that if they had known the truth, that's not really what they would have wanted to do? So that's another sort of consideration that you might want to think about, right, when you're thinking about whether your reason is a good reason.
So you've laid out a couple of kinds of reasons that we might have, some to do with respect and some
Right.
to do with harm. If we disagree about what to do, at first, if we have different opinions about whether it's okay to lie, to avoid harming a friend, then in order to come to some agreement about that, it would be helpful if we could make those reasons explicit, if we could make them clear,
Right.
and see which ones we agree on.
Exactly. So maybe let's talk about one other tip that it's good to keep in mind, and that is that when a case is presented to you, you might ask yourself, what are the assumptions that are either hidden or maybe not so hidden in the case as it's presented? How is it being framed? So let's consider an example. One of the cases, number 5, the compensation for nonprofits, has a reference to an article, and I'm going to read this, that's called The 10 Insanely Overpaid Nonprofit Executives. What does that title suggest about the issue? What does insanely overpaid mean? Is it making certain assumptions about the distinction between for-profit and non-for-profit organizations? Is it suggesting that because organizations might be different in this way, that means that salaries of executives should be different? And maybe we should also think about how valid that distinction really is.
So we don't need to accept that framing that we're offered as the right framing.
Right.
And in fact, we might want to think about alternate ways of framing the case. One way to think about finding alternative frames would be to think about the various perspectives of the various individuals involved in the case. Some of those individuals are going to be actors, the people who are in a position to do something that affects the situation. Some of those people might be individuals or groups that are affected by potential actions.
Right.
And so if we think about each of their perspectives, some assumptions that we haven't already recognized might become visible to us, including things that might be harmed and things that might deserve respect.
Right, exactly. So even just thinking about the case we just mentioned, which is the case we're going to discuss, one of the assumptions that's embedded in there about profit versus not-for-profit might be that, well, for-profit organizations don't get tax subsidies or tax exemptions and nonprofit do. But maybe that distinction isn't quite as distinct as we might think. After all, there are many corporations that get get subsidies and get tax exemptions. There are even corporations like universities and even the National Football League that are classified as nonprofit. So these are the sorts of things that we want to sort of keep in mind as possible assumptions that may be influencing how we think about the distinction. So maybe let's talk about the case. The case that we're going to talk about then is the compensation for nonprofits. Now, we're going to assume that you're familiar with the case, that you've read it, and that you understand roughly what the issues are as presented in the case. So in the case, then, the main issue is, should executives at nonprofit corporations have some limit on the salary that they're paid? Why? Now, an ethical consideration would be, one type of ethical consideration would be, well, what kind of harm is produced by paying people too much money, perhaps?
So one group that I think of that might be harmed is the general public, because the general public pays taxes, and those taxes are used to subsidize both nonprofit and, in some cases, for-profit companies. Mm-hmm. So the money that is paid to very well-paid executives of nonprofit companies is money that's not available to the government, to the general public, to do other things we value. We also want our bridges repaired. We want meat inspected. We want the government to do all the functions that it's set up to do. And if it's not doing those things, maybe we want the money to be kept by the taxpayer. We don't want it to go as profit to very well-paid executives.
Okay, good. And maybe, so in addition to thinking about the public who's perhaps subsidizing the nonprofit organization, we could also think about the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of the activity of the nonprofit organization. So whether it's battered women, or it's an organization that's trying to educate voters or alleviate poverty or whatever, we might say, well, most of the resources of the nonprofit organization should go to those beneficiaries, not necessarily to the executives running the company. On the other hand, you might want to say, still, you would want your nonprofit organization to be a well-run organization, and so you want to attract highly qualified and competent people to be the executives running those organizations. So you probably do want to be able to pay them reasonably well so that you, in fact, increase the benefit, so to speak, of what the nonprofit organization is doing, right? Because if it's not well run, it won't be benefiting the people that it's hoping to benefit.
And moreover, if those executives aren't reasonably compensated, then they themselves might struggle and might need to be the beneficiaries of an organization like they work for. So another kind of consideration we might think about related to that is whether there is a concern about fairness. So a possible fairness idea that we could think about is the idea that equal work deserves equal pay. So whether it's done by a man or a woman, for instance, the work should be rewarded if it's of equal quality and an equal amount. It should be rewarded the same way. So is there a question about that, about equal work and equal pay in this case?
I think that's a really good point. So let's think about for-profit executives. I mean, sometimes people say, well, they're really just working for the money, and so it's okay that they're paid whatever they're paid. But let's think about that. The executive in a for-profit corporation is presumably working for the good of the company, right? And that's manufacturing or providing whatever services, consulting services, financial services, whatever it is that the company does. So the executive who is successful at doing that is presumably compensated for accomplishing the goals of the company. And of course, that success is measured often in terms of the profitability of the company, but the success of the executive is rewarded typically financially. And it's not so much that the executive is lining her own pocket, right? In fact, if that's what the executive were doing and using the company solely for her own gain, we think of that as fraud and rightly look with moral dismay on such an activity. So in the case of the for-profit corporation, the executive is still working in some sense for the good of the company, or at least should be.
To increase its profit.
Right.
But there's something that the executives at nonprofit companies do, which is similar to working for profit, which is trying to create as much helpfulness to society or as much benefit as possible. And we might tie their compensation to that outcome, just like we tie the compensation of for-profit executives to profit.
Right. So success is measured differently in each case. In the one case, it's measured by, let's say, profitability, and in the other case, by the success of helping others or accomplishing the mission of the organization, whatever it happens to be. But in either case, you might want to say, well, gee, people are doing the same sort of job, they have the same sort of responsibility, they work just as hard, they should in some sense be rewarded similarly, right? It's a sort of kind of respecting persons and treating them fairly, treating them equally idea that sort of underlies that thought.
So let's think about a third kind of moral reason. We've talked about harm, we've talked about fairness. What about moral motivation?
But you know what? That's a really good point. But I had another thought about the for-profit, non-profit distinction that bears on the salary issue. And maybe we should think about this too. Remember, I was saying a little bit earlier about how the for-profit corporations often have subsidies or get tax exemptions from the government. So in thinking about the salary or the compensation of the executives, that issue might come up again in people's minds, right? So maybe we should also kind of clarify a little bit more there. So the for-profit organizations, as we mentioned before, do get tax exemptions in some cases. Some of them are heavily subsidized. They're also indirectly subsidized by the public because they use roads and sewers. Sometimes they rely on fire departments and police departments, all of which are paid for out of public monies. Moreover, executives at for-profit corporations are sometimes compensated in ways, for example, with stock options, that are taxed at a lower rate than ordinary income. And you might think of that as a sort of tax benefit or a tax exemption for people at for-profit corporations that the salaried compensation of the nonprofit CEO wouldn't experience. And my point is just that the distinction between nonprofit and for-profit might not be quite as clear and distinct as the original presentation of the case suggests, because there are all these sorts of ways in which both profit and nonprofit organizations benefit from various policies and exemptions and subsidies, etc., from the public, from the state, from the government.
So maybe we can talk about moral motivation
let's
as well,
go to that,
right?
Absolutely.
So this is a third kind of consideration, and we might think that the executives and other workers at nonprofit companies or organizations should be motivated by a sense of altruism, that is, a desire to benefit others. And if executives are making a lot of money for themselves, we might think that that's their motivation rather than trying to do something good. But then I wonder whether, if we're holding executives at nonprofit organizations to that kind of standard, whether we should also hold the executives at for-profit companies to that sort of standard as well. After all, shouldn't everybody be motivated by the same desire to do well? Isn't it unreasonable to raise the bar for nonprofit workers and not hold for-profit workers to the same kind of standard as people?
Right. I think that's a really good point. In other words, why should we think that the nonprofit CEO has to be sort of a morally better person than the for-profit CEO? Maybe we should actually be flipping the argument and saying, as you point out, that the for-profit executives should, in fact, be encouraged to be more moral, if you will, right? And whether that means, producing their products more sustainably or making sure that there's safety in the processes by which they produce things or whatever. But it does seem a little unfair to say that, well, we're only going to hold some people to the idea that they should be moral and yet at the same time let other people off the hook. That doesn't seem consistent with what we mean by morality, right? Which is that it's something everybody should be committed to. So we've not covered all the possible bases in this case, and we've talked a little bit about what ethical reasons are. We've talked a little bit about examining assumptions and how a case is framed. And we've also looked at 3 specific kinds of reasons that you could consider in this particular case. So we've looked at the harm consideration, where we talked about the possibility of particular persons being harmed, maybe the public in general being harmed. In other words, there are a variety of ways in which you can look at the notion of harm. Then we looked at the issue of fairness and equality, which is a sort of, how do we treat people? How do we think of persons and how they should be treated, that notion. And then we also considered the idea of moral motivation. What kind of person should we want people to be, whether they work for profit or non-profit organizations?
So we hope that gives you some ideas to discuss as you're preparing for the Ethics Bowl, and thank you very much for listening.